Hello, and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian Literature for the Inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, a PhD student in Russian Lit. This week, thinking about what if I wasn't a PhD student anymore? Maybe I drop out. Maybe I become a microgreens farmer. Maybe I podcast full-time. Who's to say? The possibilities are really limitless.
And I am Cameron Lalana. And speaking of limitless possibilities, I tried to engage in that and flew a little bit too close to the sun. My job has recently given me one of the nice new MacBook Pros with the M1 chip. And then, fool that I was, I saw the sun too brightly and tried to get 4 monitors. And so I bought a triple dock. And it turns out the Apple's M1 chip can only support output to a single screen. So now, fool that I am, I've got 3 monitors on my desk over my work computer, 2 of which are completely functionless.
I hope everybody comes and points at you and laughs. They come from far and wide.
Oh, joke's gonna be on them. I'm gonna hook up a p.4 to one on the right and track down some other HDMI enabled system to plug into the one on the left.
That sounds like work's going well. Well, this is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or 2, or however many it's been by this point.
Did you get started early?
Oh, big time.
Oh, nice.
My dog was being terrible. I mean, what's a man supposed to do?
I think one of the biggest things about this podcast, if you see a variance in how the episode goes, the biggest factor is whether or not we started drinking before the podcast, and if we have, how long before the podcast we started drinking.
I don't know if I agree. Sometimes our people in Discord are like, this was the drunkest episode I've ever seen. And it's like, I had like a quarter of a beer on that one. I'm not sure what you're hearing.
That's
on
true.
That, but I appreciate it, I think.
I think we had 2 episodes in a row, one which was probably one of our drunkest ones where we were just drinking straight liquor, and one where we were both relatively sober. And for some reason, people kept telling me that the one we were relatively sober was like, you know, like you said, the drunkest episode.
I'm not sure what to make of that. Anyways.
We get smarter when we drink? I don't know.
That could be it. Anyways.
Anyway.
We're reading Stalingrad again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What part of Stalingrad are we reading, Matt?
Part 4 of the arbitrarily decided pages that I've selected. If I am correct, and I don't... are we starting on 52 this time?
We are doing 53 to 69.
Ooh, I was so close.
So close.
Ah, there it is.
Very confusingly, part 4 of our series. So actually, the book itself, although it is actually also divided into parts, it's divided into 3 parts. So yeah. Extremely confusingly, part 4 of our podcast intersects with the ending of part 1 of the actual book.
Correct. But I don't know how... I mean, I would love if the podcast episodes aligned with the book, but it's not going to happen. I'm not talking about 400 pages. Like, it would take us forever. We'd have to switch to 6-hour episodes once a month.
Counterpoint, that is basically what we did when we did our What Is to Be Done. Each of those books were between 250 and 400 pages.
That was a bad time.
I
did not have fun.
No. I mean, it was interesting. It was interesting reading. But before... I thought it was interesting. I went back and listened to those like a month or 2 ago. I thought it was interesting listening.
No,
I think I wiped that entire period from my mind. But
I think Chernyshevsky kind of slaps, and that's a really... No one in my program seems to think so. Whenever you bring him up to professors, they're like, it's so boring. It's such dry writing. I don't know. I don't think so. Pretty interesting 150 pages on the sewing commune. Kind of enjoyed it. Almost made me think maybe we should start a sewing commune.
Yeah, how can any piece of literature that has Rakhmetov in it, how could that be interesting? How could any piece of literature where a character eats 5 pounds of ham and that's not even a big thing, that's just like a casual introductory piece?
There's more on the sewing commune than how he physically is able to digest that much meat. I think people don't understand the humor. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure that Chernyshevsky intended it to be funny, but boy, it really was.
Yeah. But before we carry on too much about what is to be done, I got to ask you, Matt, what are you drinking today?
I am drinking vodka and Trader Joe's lemonade from my fridge because I am moving soon and I need to finish things so I don't have to move them. And that's a really convenient excuse that I can tell myself.
Well, it's kind of on brand. I think at some point, I want to say Cream Off drinks beetroot moonshine. So kind of like that, kind of on brand.
Gotta make do with what you got.
Exactly.
What are you drinking? I'm sure it's leaps and bounds better.
So I have from High Water Brewing, which is I guess it's not technically local. It's from Lodi, which is north from where I live. But I have a Campfire Stout, which is a stout with graham crackers, molasses, and other natural flavors. Which is I'm happy it cooled down today. It was very hot earlier. This would not be good in hot weather. However, for nice moderate 80, pretty good.
I'm into it. I'm happy one of us brought a real drink. It's nice that you prepared for the podcast. It's like, what are we drinking tonight? Just throw it in. That will make the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, it's our balance. It's the balance.
Yes.
Liquor on one hand, beer on the other. You know what they say, liquor before beer, never a better podcast.
They do say that. It's actually on our website now. It's a shirt you can buy. That's how I hold myself accountable, is I say things on the podcast and then I have to do them. Yeah,
that's fair. Okay, so for today's context, we're going to be continuing on to the second half of the war for Grossman, as you'll hear from us again soon. Andrew Popoff's book, Vasily Grossman and the Soviet Century, as well as some supplemental readings from Luba Vinogradova and Anthony Beevor's book, Vasily Grossman, A Writer at War, which is a collection of his writings along with their commentary as historians on that, and bringing in some secondary sources from other contemporaries of Grossman's. Both of them are highly recommended books, and I will be including them in the show notes. Speaking of books, before we get into the actual context, let's continue on to our book recommendation of the day. This one's going to be a little bit different. It's the book Between Tears and Laughter by Lin Yutang. So Lin Yutang was a Chinese intellectual who at this time was living in the United States during World War II. Between Tears and Laughter is written, I want to say in 1943, but it is, I don't know the exact year, but it's written during the war. And so he's an interesting figure. He's the son of a Chinese Presbyterian minister, was educated for the ministry, but eventually would renounce Christianity and become a professor of English, traveling around to the United States and around Europe. So he's got an interesting perspective on matters, having someone who is educated in the West, but has a profound interest in exploring his own background. I want to say. One of his books actually is sitting in my shelf right now, which I've been meaning to get to for a long time, Moment in Peking, which I think tells a story set in Beijing in the very early 20th century, but it's also quite a large book, so I haven't had the time to get to it just yet. But Between Tears and Laughter, it's essentially a commentary. It's a large opinion piece, really, covering a large number of topics. You have to remember when this is being written, the war is still very much, the outcome of the war is still very much in contention. So seeing him write about these figures and the morality of it, and the morality of not just, figures like Stalin, but also figures like Churchill, who Lin Yutang absolutely hates because of Churchill's continual denial of material support to Chinese guerrilla forces fighting the Japanese army, and the way that especially British politics have, in a way, made the war much worse for China. But no, it's not just that, not just a commentary, but it's also him philosophizing a bit of how do we, for example, return to a better, what will Chinese society be like after the war? How do we return to a better society? He calls for return to a society by music and many other things. It's really interesting to see his perspective on a lot of matters. And he's very critical of domestic policy in the U.S., foreign policy on the U.S. and Britain. And it's a really fascinating book. Definitely not a perspective you hear often, or frankly, even ever, in mainstream conversations about the war. And I think one of the there's a line in it that actually has been stuck with me ever since. There's certain lines from books which just stick with me forever, and this is one of them. I am no longer angry. Only the stupidity of it all is a little boring. Which, yeah, as a younger person, it resonated and still sticks with me sometimes. So that's it. Between Tears and Laughter, you can find it in the list, which is going to be in the show notes. As per usual, the list is a little bit too long to be actually included in the show notes, but there's a link to the full list, which has all the book recommendations we've talked about previously, as well as other ones. And if you'd like to contribute more, you can, of course, email them to tipsytolstoy@gmail.com. Okay, so let's talk about the second half of World War II, and this is going to overlap a little bit. We're going to start in 1942, which overlaps a little bit with what we were talking about last time at the end of the fight in Stalingrad. Now, this is going to focus a lot, especially on what it meant to be Jewish on the Eastern Front during the war. For a sense of context, about 5 million Jews lived in the Soviet Union before Hitler attacked in 1941. Approximately half of this number were killed during the German occupation. And by 1941, Soviet newspapers were already publishing reports about massacres of Soviet Jews specifically, and by the end of 1942, roughly where we're starting, Pravda and Izvestia had already carried their first commentaries on the so-called final solution. So Grossman at this time would have already been aware of the Nazi war machine's specific plans regarding Jewish people, but he discovered much more about the particulars and the extent of this Nazi barbarism as 42, especially 43 onward, Soviet troops began to push the Wehrmacht back and began to return to prior Soviet territories or other Eastern European nations, Poland, etc. Especially once we get to Poland, it's going to be something we'll focus on much more later. So by late 1942, when Grossman's visiting Luhansk, which of course is modern-day Ukraine, he heard about the thousands of Jews there who were killed by the so-called Einsatzgruppen, who carried out the Holocaust by gun and by gas. And he writes, "I often dream of Mama, but during this trip I dreamt of her the whole night and saw her as vividly as if she were alive. After that I was in a horrible state all day. No, I don't believe she is alive. I travel the entire time through the regions that have been liberated from the Germans and see what these damned beasts were doing to old people and children. And Mama was Jewish. I feel a strong desire to exchange my pen for a rifle." But of course, Grossman would not, although tempted, actually turn to the rifle and, in fact, use his pen to write some of the very first fiction written about the Holocaust as they pushed east during the war. It should be noted at the same time, although as he was finding out about this, anti-Semitism was on the rise in the Soviet Union. An important one to come, and of what was to come, Grossman's editor would actually quit in 1943 after being told that there were too many Jews among his correspondents and asked to dismiss some of them. He chose instead to tell them, well, you'll have one Jew less, and quit himself. And now, other correspondents during the war would be openly anti-Semitic to Jewish correspondents. For example, the author of Quiet Flows the Don, Mikhail Sholokhov, who was a fairly rabid anti-Semite, would insult a contemporary of Grossman's, Ilya Ehrenberg, on the basis of his Jewishness. In a conversation, Sholokhov would, when were discussing the war, made a remark about Abraham being in Tashkent making a profit. The idea being that somehow in the war started by Nazi Germany, it is somehow the Jewish people who are materially benefiting. So Ehrenberg would tell Grossman about this, and Grossman would write back, if this was ever something of this magnitude was written about me, I think I'd just crawl under a rock and never come out. I think about Sholokhov's anti-Semitic slander with pain and contempt. Here on the Southwestern Front, there are thousands, tens of thousands of Jews. They are walking with machine guns into the snowstorms, breaking into towns held by the Germans, falling in battle. I saw all of this. If Sholokhov is in Kuibyshev, be sure to let him know that comrades at the front know what he is saying. Let him be ashamed. It's also important to note here that out of about 450,000 Jews who served in the Soviet army, roughly 40% of them were killed. So at the same time that we have both the Nazi barbarism pushing in from the West, we also have this current of anti-Semitism, which would of course continue on throughout the war and come to a much greater stead after the war too. Keep in mind when Stalin dies, they're in the midst of accusing a group of Jewish doctors of trying to kill him and demanding that Jewish intellectuals sign letters condemning them and calling for their execution, but that isn't a main feature yet. So continuing on to 1943, let's start talking about Operation Citadel. Now, Operation Citadel happens outside of Kursk. It's one of the largest tank battles that's ever taken place in the, let me check the show notes, and I'm going to double check that if it's the largest tank battle that's ever taken place, but it is absolutely one of the largest ones. And at this point, Soviet wartime production now outproduces Germany's ability to produce especially tanks, motorized vehicles as a whole. And Grossman would note at this time that this new generation of Soviet command with 2 years of war under their belt had learned from the costly mistakes of the early war. And Ortenberg, Grossman's editor, of course, talks about Grossman, his experience on the front lines, and he writes, Grossman saw the battlefield with his own eyes. He saw destroyed enemy armor and our burning tanks and self-propelled guns. He saw our troops attack and retreat. He also saw the wounded and dead Soviet soldiers, and he believed it was dishonorable to remain silent about this. Grossman would write about, would condemn commanders who were insufficiently interested in their soldiers, writing in July of 1943, there are many commanders who don't care about their soldiers' food in everyday life. They don't try to study the soldier's soul. Commanders are sometimes very harsh, but during breaks in the fighting, they don't go to their men, talk to them, and ask questions. Often this is because the commanders are too young. It is sometimes the case that a junior officer has soldiers who have sons older than he is. Later writing to, the cry of forward, forward is either the result of stupidity or fear of one's seniors. That's why so much blood is being shed. It's also important to note here that this is a changing war, and outside of Kursk, it's different. Stalingrad, of course, is a battle of street to street. It was a battle of submachine gunners and storming attacks and snipers of person-to-person combat. But in Kursk, this is a tank battle, and it's not just of tanks against tanks, it's of artillery against tanks, and the sword of the artillery crushing the tanks before the counterattack of Soviet tanks have even begun. It's much more sophisticated, I guess, in broader terms. It incorporates a much greater military technology rather than soldier to soldier, gun to gun, which is just a technological, essentially, rock fight. And the Soviet army continues pushing west, recapturing areas that Grossman would remember retreating from early in the war. Upon the recapture of the city of Orel, Grossman would write, which of course I should also note Grossman retreated from in 1941. I remembered the Orel which I had seen exactly 22 months ago on that October day of 1941 when German tanks broke into it from the Kromsk highway. I remembered my last night in Orel, the ill, terrible night, the humming of fleeing vehicles, the weeping of women running after the retreating troops, the sorrowful faces of people, and the questions that they were asking me, full of anxiety and suffering. I remembered Orel's last morning when it seemed as if the whole city was then still in its full beauty without a single window broken, but it gave the impression of being doomed and having been sentenced to death. Later, when listening to the speech of a tank colonel, he would further write, this colonel, who was standing on top of a dusty tank overlooking the bodies of soldiers and officers killed in the battle for Orel, hearing his simple, abrupt words of goodbye echoing in the burnt-out houses, I understood. This meeting today and that bitter parting on the October morning of 1941 are inseparably linked with one another. Now, at the same time, at Ilya Ehrenberg's urging, Grossman would join the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which was a group of Jewish intellectuals who would fight fascism in various forms, usually by way of pen. And at this time, members of the American Committee of Jewish Writers, Artists, and Scientists reached out to the JAC in order to ask them to assemble records of Nazi crimes. And looming in the shadow of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was more than happy to accept it. And in 1943, Ehrenberg would ask Grossman to join the journalists working on their project, which would eventually become known as the Complete Black Book of Russian Jewry, although that would not be published in the USSR, and we'll talk more about that later. In 1943, now we're moving far into Ukraine. In November of 1943, the Red Army would take Kyiv back from the Nazis, and the foreign press was brought to Babi Yar. And Babi Yar, of course, is the site of some of the largest executions, not in the camps. Babi Yar was the mass execution site of likely over 100,000 people, the greatest slaughter taking place on September 29th and 30th in 1941 on the eve of Yom Kippur, which at that time 30,771 Jews were executed in the deep ravines on the city outskirts. Traveling across Ukraine, Grossman would hear everywhere about similar events, about the mass execution of Jews, and he would write and submit to an article to Znamya called Ukraine Without Jews. Although the actual story would eventually be suppressed by censors, it would be published in Yiddish in the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee's newspapers. And he would write, I'm going to read a couple lines from it. Jews are silent across Ukraine. None are left in Ukraine. Nowhere in Poltava, in Kharkov, in Kremenchuk, in Borispol, and Yagotin, in none of the cities, hundreds of towns and thousands of villages will you see a young girl's black tear-filled eyes, hear the sorrowful voice of an old woman, see the swarthy-skinned little face of a hungry child. Silence. Stillness. An entire people murdered. And as he wrote this article in typical Grossman fashion, he would focus on the humanity of each person. All having been murdered, many hundreds of thousands, 1 million Jews in Ukraine. This is not the death of armed people during the war, of people who left behind a home, a family, a field, songs, traditions, stories. This is the murder of a people, murder of a house, of a family, of books, of faith. This is the murder of the tree of life. This is the death of roots, not of branches and leaves. This is the murder of a people's soul and body, murder of a great skillful experience created generation after generation by thousands of clever and talented craftsmen and intellectuals. This is the murder of a people's morality, of customs, humorous stories passed on from grandfathers to their sons. This is the murder of memories, of a sad song, of a people's poetry about a merry and bitter life. This is the destruction of a hearth, of cemeteries. This is the death of a people which lived for centuries beside the Ukrainian people, worked, sinned, and did good deeds, and was dying on the same land. Our grandfathers lived here. Our mothers have given birth to us here. The mothers of our sons were born here. So much sweat and tears were shed, it seems, only few could refer to a Jew as a stranger and say that this land was not his land. This war, as Alexander Popov writes, tested Grossman's beliefs as a humanist, as a pacifist, and as an internationalist. At the same time, he perceived the war as a battle between internationalism and fascism. Ehrenberg would recall a conversation they had in Moscow when Grossman was on furlough. We sat until 3 a.m. He talked about the front, and we were guessing what life would be like after the war. Grossman said, "I now doubt many things. What I don't doubt is victory. Perhaps this matters most." So I mentioned before the Complete Black Book of Russian Jewry, which was the project that the JAC put together in order to create a record of Nazi crimes. And although the Kremlin showed support for the project abroad and publicly, at home they showed limited enthusiasm, and it would be later banned in the 1940s. Continuing on to the next year, Berdichev, which is, of course, where Grossman was born, was liberated by the Red Army on January 5th in 1944, and Grossman would immediately begin to search for any relatives who may have survived. And he writes his wife, "My dear Lyusenka, yesterday I was in Kiev. It's hard to convey what I experienced in the few hours visiting the addresses of relatives and acquaintances. There are only graves and death. Today I'm going to Berdichev. My comrades have already been out there. They say that the city is completely destroyed, empty, and that of many thousands, tens of thousands of Jews who have lived there, only a few, perhaps 10 people, have survived. I have no hope of finding Mama alive. The only thing I'm hoping for is to learn something about her last days and death." We know until the end of his life, Grossman would carry around 2 letters that he had written to his mother about her death, both of them written long after the events. With them are 2 photos, which have, the documentarians have never been included in any reproductions of the letters. As I think it's Chandler who notes in the book The Road that although they republish the letters that Grossman carries around to his mother, it seems that the photos and one of the photos which he carried with one of the letters of his mother was a mass grave of many Jewish people who had been killed in a ravine, and was very likely among that the bodies was of his own mother, although it was impossible to tell who exactly it was. Probably something that was given Grossman's tendency to never reduce people to merely the moment of their death, but to focus on the moment of their life. Probably would not have wanted people to see that. That's a very private thing, just to reflect on his own guilt and grief over the death of his mother. So in 1944, as the Red Army continues to push west, Odessa being liberated in April, Grossman would learn more about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and about the Treblinka extermination camp and about the many other camps as they went further west. Although, Popov notes that Grossman struggled with his intense desire to maintain a sort of even-handedness or a sense of humanity about everyone involved in the war. It was a struggle, but it's something he continued to write about. Popov writes, Grossman's main message, however, that the war failed to destroy humanity and people, and that Nazism, the world's greatest evil, contains the seeds of its own destruction. He describes an incident that bolstered his faith in humanity's goodwill. A wounded German soldier is sitting by the roadside near Bobruisk, watching Soviet tanks and artillery stream into the burning city. A Red Army soldier approaches him and gives him some water. Moved by this, Grossman tells this story to remind the Red Army, soon to enter Germany, about an old tradition to take pity on the weak. In contrast, Ehrenberg, in his columns, expressed hatred of Germany and called for revenge, referring to the German people as a colossal gang. Grossman, and this is something to specifically note, because as Grossman is writing specifically on the camps, it's interesting to see the terminology he'll use, especially, and we'll talk about that in a moment, especially once we enter July of 1944, when the Red Army enters Majdanek, which is one of the 6 killing centers that were in Poland liberated by the Red Army. Unlike other camps, the SS did not have time to destroy the evidence of what happened in that camp, allowing the Soviets to film it. It should be noted here that in most camps, late in the war, based on Heinrich Himmler's orders, most camps were, and this is where the introduction of mass crematoriums were in these camps to get rid of the bodies, which by and large had already been killed by gas and buried in these camps, to destroy the evidence of what had happened. Of course, in Majdanek, there was not time for this, and Grossman would enter along with many other correspondents. Writing of this time, we have Yevgeny Dolmatovsky, who wrote about his time with Grossman, and especially his time with Grossman in Treblinka. In one interview of a guard of the camp, Dolmatovsky recalls this interaction. "How many people did you gas each day?" 900, I think. As an aside, the author notes, the word people is not used. And then after a pause, "Up to 2,000. How did you spend your time afterwards?" "We sang songs." "What songs, for example?" "O Tannenbaum, O Tannenbaum." And although Grossman's article about Treblinka makes no mention of the song, in Life and Fate, German soldiers do sing O Tannenbaum in Stalingrad as they unwrap Christmas gifts. Well, in this particular interrogation, Dolmatovsky writes that Vasily Semyonovich literally jumped out of the bunker. "I followed him. He stood in the cold wind and tears were pouring from underneath his glasses. Later he told me that it's because of the strong wind. He regained his composure, buttoned his greatcoat, and returned to the bunker where the interrogation was taking place." As a side note, Dolmatovsky also recalls meeting Grossman early in the war, and in 1942, near Stalingrad, Grossman actually would rescue Dolmatovsky during a bombardment. Finding him wounded in a house, Grossman carried him on his back to a field hospital, and to Dolmatovsky's surprise, Grossman appears to have never mentioned this episode to anyone else. After visiting Treblinka, Grossman would write a remarkable story of it, called The Hell of Treblinka, and it's a story pulled together from as many people as he could think, as he could find to talk to. He spoke with a captured Ukrainian guard, identified in his notebook as Ivan Shevchenko, who had served with the SS as a volunteer auxiliary. His notebook contains drawings of the death camp's layout, of the railway station, the road, the 6-meter wall surrounding the camp, the uniform rectangles of the barracks, and the facilities for the Germans, including a bakery and a barber shop. He recorded the hymn the SS men composed that Treblinka's laborers were forced to sing before execution. The Hell of Treblinka is a difficult read. I've talked about it previously on this podcast. If you can, I would recommend you do so. I would recommend you, if you can find something online, you should, if possible, read one that has commentary by historians, as The Hell of Treblinka does contain some major factual errors, which is not, as far as we can tell, of maliciousness on Grossman's part, but of simple misunderstanding or an eyewitness testimony failing to give correct information. For example, Grossman estimates that Treblinka was the largest death camp, which was, if his math is actually correct, and if all his information was correct, would have been true. However, where he fails is that he believed the people told him that trains arrived every day, whereas in fact, we know in some periods of the war, trains did in fact arrive every day, but in other periods, maybe only one train would arrive per week. So that variance actually created was why the actual number of people killed in Treblinka was much lower than the 3 million Grossman estimates in the story. So reasons like that are a good reason to read one with a historian's commentary to correct small errors like that. Although not that that's a small error, but an error that does not fundamentally alter what the Hell of Treblinka means, but just correcting numbers. In the story collection, The Road, collected by Robert Chandler, it does include commentary from a historian as well. So that was a good resource to use. I'm going to read 2 lines from Treblinka. This commentary has gone a little long already, but it's a difficult read and a worthwhile read, and I think this line will tell you why you should. The beasts and the beast philosophy seemed to portend the sunset of Europe, the sunset of the world, but the red was not the red of the sunset. It was the red blood of humanity, a humanity that was dying yet achieving victory through its death. People remained people. They did not accept the morality and laws of fascism. It is the writer's duty to tell the horrible truth, and it is the reader's civic duty to learn this truth. To turn away, to close one's eyes, and walk past is to insult the memory of those who perished. It's notable here that Grossman, who was adamant always about retaining people, their humanity, the Hell of Treblinka is entirely about the humanity of the people in the camps, never allowing them to be reduced to what the Nazis had wanted them to be reduced to, except for those true adherents of Nazism who are merely the beasts and only ever the beasts. Throughout the rest of the war, Grossman would continue to learn more about these crimes and would write about them, often as articles with too many specificities being censored or suppressed. Towards the end of the war, Grossman would be there to witness the Battle of Berlin, which contained some of the cruelest and bloodiest fighting of the war. And on the final day of the Red Army victory in Berlin, Alexander Beck recalls standing on the roof of the Reichstag next to Grossman. They saw columns of POWs, the city of smoke, and in the square below, Soviet tanks and field kitchens. Grossman was silent, his usual reserved self. Then he said the words that became memorable to Beck. Evil is overthrown. And for now, let's leave the context for today there and continue on with the story itself. So let's talk about part 4 of Stalingrad. So we open up chapter 53, going back to a bird's eye perspective as Grossman talks about the war and what it was and what, as he says, Nazi Germany did not understand they were fighting, which is they were fighting a people's war. As he goes through the disaster of the early war for the Soviet Union, he then transitions into talking about how much Soviet industry, once it was functional, made them ready for war, and which is why he calls it the People's War, because it was the people creating the industry under fire, essentially, which made the Soviet Union ready for war in the later years, which is industry is something that we're going to be talking about a fair amount in this part. And Grossman writes on this subject, if this vast amount of work has, to many, seemed insignificant, it is because it is the vastest things that most often escape our notice. But all the same, as we kind of go back to the era of 1942, not from the kind of future perspective, at this time the Wehrmacht has deployed 240 divisions, which is comprised of more than 3 million men against the Red Army. And although in the winter of 1941, the Germans were essentially routed outside of Moscow, they are back on the offensive and they are pushing the Red Army back. So as the Wehrmacht is pushing the Red Army back, we're going towards Stalingrad, although of course it hasn't gotten there yet. And we return to the Shiposhnikova family, for whom the war infects everything. Grossman writes, it was impossible to get away from the war. If the Shiposhnikovs tried to talk about Victor's work, this at once led them to think of his mother. If they mentioned Ludmila, the conversation would soon turn to Tolya. Was he, or wasn't he, still alive? Grief was lurking outside, ready to fling open every door of the house.
Can we talk about this particular chapter has a great example of those lines that are very Grossman-esque when he's describing the relationship between Sofia Marussia and her daughter Vera, and how Vera returns home and she's, kind of very cross with everybody. And Sofia criticizes her to Marussia, and he says that, but Marussia reserved for herself the right to complain about her daughter, saying that she, against Sofia, then immediately takes Vera's side. I just thought in the midst of as he does, in the midst of the bird's eye view, to bring it back down to what is essentially a very global phenomenon that feels hyper specific to these set of people.
Yeah. The family dynamics are in full swing, which also I think later on, is it Zhenya? Zhenya will eventually later on get into an argument with Vera, and Zhenya will note that although people often think that kind of Vera took this sudden temper from her father's side, from Stepan Spiridonov's side, it's actually Marussia who has that temper, which again is not just said but shown in. It's just Marussia arguing with her daughter, but the moment that Sofia Osipovna, trying to support Marussia, by sympathizing with her over Vera being difficult, like you say. Marcia immediately switches, and because only she gets to complain about her daughter.
Speaking of Zhenya, how hot is Zhenya? We need to have a separate counter for the way that Grossman weaves in, like anytime she's mentioned by any character, their internal monologue is always, yes, this beautiful, I think this beautiful aunt or this beautiful whatever relation she is to the person that this, other character is talking about. It's like almost 100% of the time the narrator has to break in to remind you of that.
Yeah.
I started noticing it on this part, and I thought it was hilarious.
It's actually funny you started noticing that, because now that I've been reading more, maybe this is because I've been recovering from Murakami's prose, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But I started to notice the way that Grossman talks about women's bodies in this a little bit more, and we'll talk about that a little more later. But
yeah, there was a few scenes.
Yeah, Zhenya, I don't think she gets such a specific treatment as some women in this book do. But yeah, you're right. Although, funnily enough, Vera's friend Zena, who we'll talk about later, is the only one who's like, well, Zhenya could be beautiful if she did, stop dressing as she does and did her hair or whatever else. Vera's friend says she needs to do, which is a funny bit. As we established in our Crime and Punishment series, the ultimate top tier of hot, 10 out of 10, is Raskolnikov, apparently. So on a scale of 1 to Raskolnikov.
Where is she? A close second, apparently.
Apparently so. So speaking of Zhenya, as we enter the house, Zhenya is thinking about Novikov. Novikov, of course, has not been around since the last time he showed up in the middle of the night. And this leads her to think of him, and thinking of Novikov leads her to think of her prior husband, Krimov. And she's wondering she's not wondering why she left him. She's wondering why she stopped loving him. It's written, why had she stopped loving him? Was it he who had changed, or her? Had she come to understand him better, or was it that she no longer understood him?
This was a great scene.
Yeah, it's such... I love the way that her emotions are portrayed. She obviously still has, like, through the scene, still cares for Krimov, but as she said, it's a very pitying love. And at this point in time, Krimov is losing prestige, or at least when she left him. And he seems to think that that's the reason that their marriage is failing. And he even jokes about her seeing him in the future when she's married to someone much more high status. But she reasserts that really wasn't the reason, and she can't even think of it. It was just, well, she doesn't know. But it certainly wasn't that. It wasn't for the material reasons that Krimov assumed, and maybe others do as well. So like we mentioned, Vera gets into a fight with Zhenya. In this case, it's actually Vera has come back after her day at the hospital. Zhenya asks for some help, and Vera just pretty much blows up at her and storms off. And at this point, you have this interaction between Marussia and Sofia Osipovna, and Zhenya thinking about Vera's temper, and she gets it from Marussia. And suddenly, Novikov arrives and asks Vera to go out for a walk. And they go out, and this whole time when they're walking, Zhenya is really worried that he's going to confess his love for her, because she feels this sense of something hanging over them. But the whole time they're walking, he just keeps talking about work the whole time. And she actually gets kind of angry at this, that, like, she's not exactly sure at what, but she kind of speaks on the absence of, she eventually breaks in and speaks on the absence of love in the modern era, conveying the story of Tristan and Isolde being an older kind of fairy tale about two star-crossed lovers. Isolde, or is it Tristan? I honestly don't remember. I think it's Tristan. Tristan's the knight, leaves behind. Is it Tristan? One of them is nobility. One of them is just like a kind of a common person, and they give everything up to go live in the woods. So at this point, we go back to Vera's perspective. And when Vera stormed out of that conversation with Zhenya, she went to go see her friend Zina Melikovna's place. And Zina is not much older than Vera. She's only about 21, but she's been married for the last 2 years. And in her 2 years of marriage, she's traveled quite a bit. So to Vera, Zina seems quite worldly and traveled. And Grossman writes on this kind of relationship between an interesting passage about how some people can understand each other and despise each other, and how other people can not understand each other but have a sense of familiarity that people who understand each other don't. Writing, Zina Melikovna may not have understood Vera, but she understood very well how Vera imagined her, and she took care to show Vera the particular qualities, the freedom from calculation and convention that she knew Vera most wanted to see in her. And so Zina is giving Vera lots of advice on this. And at this point, we find out that not one-to-one, but part of the reason for Vera's mood in the day is that the pilot, the young pilot Viktorov, who she's kind of fallen in love with, suddenly left the hospital and was being redeployed back to the front lines. And Vera has this kind of romantic notion that she'll find him after being shot down and take him to a cabin in the woods and, be able to stitch him up, and they'll have some sort of great romance. But she's equally certain that he's just going to die out there. In Xena, in response to this, again, knowing how Vera sees her better than she actually, frankly, understands Vera, it tells her story of a German officer who falls in love with a young Russian woman, and the German officer, after spending time with her, goes and turns himself into to his superiors and is shot as a spy for refusing to give up her name, which Vera considers to be a great romantic story, and goes back home to tell it to Zhenya and Sofia Osipovna and Novikov. At this point, Zhenya kind of explodes at Vera. Not exactly, but she calls the tale that Vera has told them contemptible for the times they're in. They all argue. Again, Sofia Osipovna tries to, again, the whole family really, it's kind of rough on Sofia, actually. Sofia Osipovna kind of supports Zhenya, but at the same time, Zhenya turns on Sofia Osipovna and tells her any simple Russian heart can understand this. And Sofia Osipovna says, well, okay, so any Russian heart can understand it. Well, I guess my Jewish heart doesn't understand what you're trying to say, and storms off. And Zhenya is just like, that's even a sideswipe for Zhenya. So this whole family has a bit of at least Marussia and Zhenya have kind of a temper, and they kind of swipe out. And she's even a little confused why Sofia Osipovna is mad, which is interesting that this is Zhenya's reaction to that tale, considering that she has recently told Novikov the story of Tristan and Isolde, which I believe is a German in origin. And at the end of that scene, Novikov says, oh, this whole conversation has reminded me, I meant to tell you, I'm going to Moscow soon. So as an aside, we join Mostovsky's point of view, and as you recall, Mostovsky is a friend of Alexandra Shiposhnikova's. He's an old Bolshevik. He's quite the prolific writer, and he's visited by a friend of his, and they discuss, and his friend gives him a letter and says, oh, I met this an old acquaintance of mine, Ivanikov, and he managed to get a letter from this woman and was asked to bring it to the Shiposhnikovs. So here it is. Moskovsky says, okay, yeah, I'll bring it to the Shiposhnikovs. We switch over from here, from a relatively short scene, back to Victor Strum, who is, of course, in Moscow, who has been invited there to work on some projects. He is going to see Postayev in his hotel room, but walks in on a meeting of the heads of the Soviet SEAL industry at this point. And we go on to an extended scene where each of the individual characters of these men plays out in their arguments, in the way they're united, in the way they're different, in the way that some are, even by others are criticized as being too driving, and others are criticized as too lenient, not meeting enough quotas, etc. It's an interesting dynamic. And one of them at the end approaches Victor and says, oh, are you Victor Strum? And Victor says, yeah, who are you? And the guy says, oh, I'm Semyon. And Semyon, of course, is Krymov's older brother, who Krymov has not seen in some amount of time because he's leading a steel production facility in Chelyabinsk. The two discuss a little bit, and they kind of pledge to talk more later. At the same time, as Victor has been in Moscow for not a super long time, less than a month, but still, not an insignificant amount of time, recall that a young woman named Nina moved into his neighbor's apartment to stay there for a short period of time, and Victor has been spending a lot of time with her, going out for walks in the evening, discussing. It's noted that he pays very close attention to all of her stories. And on her last night in the city, Victor and Nina share some wine, and then as they're kind of discussing, he begins to kiss her hand, which, by the way, Victor, this has been like maybe a week. He's like jumping at the chance to cheat on his wife. This is like I know, like day one, it was already happening, but
yeah, it took this man no time.
Well, so as he begins kissing her hand, there's a knock on the door, and Victor goes over and opens up, and it's Novikov, who was recently redeployed to Moscow, who enters to bring tidings from the rest of the family. And Nina at this point is like, oh yeah, I forgot. I've got my friend coming by so we can go catch the train. Bye.
This man got absolutely cucked by the labyrinth of plots. Like, horrifically. Did he deserve it? Probably. But still.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, for Victor, although he does not get to cheat on his wife in this particular moment in time, he does end up really enjoying his conversation with Novikov, and the two find that they're actually quite similar despite coming from very different walks of life. And Victor thinks on later, I'm really happy that Novikov came by. I do wish he'd come by about 30 minutes later, is his exact thoughts on the matter. At this point, Victor goes out to, about a day later, he goes out to the dacha outside of Moscow retrieve some things that Ludmila has asked him to get. And on the way there, he's kind of thinking through a jumble of emotions. And he notes to himself that it always seems so easy to explain other people's behavior to Tolya and Nadia, his children, but his own feelings now seemed beyond understanding. And he kind of is thinking about his relationship with Ludmila, and they've been married for so many years. And he's had ups and downs, and every time they have a conflict, he's been noting it down, someone like an accountant, and is now trying to indict Ludmila in his own mind, although he also tells himself that this is unfair and untrue, but then goes on to say, well, what does it matter if it's untrue, too? And he arrives at the dacha and finds that it's in a bit of a mess. People have obviously been living there, but it doesn't bother him too much. Now it means he doesn't have to go get all the stuff that Ludmila asked him to get if it's been taken, and goes inside to get some stuff. And while he's getting stuff, he remembers that Novikov had given him a small package, which was the package that Ivanikov had given to Mostovsky's friend, and Mostovsky had given to the Shiposhnikovs, who then gave it to Novikov, and now is in the presence of, in the hands of Victor, who opens it up and realizes that it's a letter from his mother, and essentially her writing a goodbye letter to him before she's killed. I think it's written from when she's either slightly before or slightly after she's been put into the Nazi-created ghetto for Jewish people in the town she's in, which of course the ghettos would go on to be primarily eliminated by so-called Einsatzgruppen, by squads with either firearms or gas vans. The next couple of chapters are him kind of wandering throughout, the next couple of days, really unsure of things, before getting back into the swing of things. Sort of, still kind of distant, and in the middle of the night he gets a call from Semyon asking for the help of one of his assistants, and he says basically, I'll go. Everyone is in Kazan, they're not close enough, I will come. And also in the middle of that, an air raid is happening, and he decides just to stay above ground, so not explicitly suicidal, but kind of getting there. And he goes to Chelyabinsk. We go from here over back to Krymov, who at this point has been reassigned as the front is being pushed back towards Stalingrad. He's been reassigned to a mortar unit led by Lieutenant Sarkisian, and he witnesses a lot of conflict among the Red Army at this point. Of course, they're all retreating. Krymov is trying to get gas for Lieutenant Sarkisian, who has been unable to get it, and without that, they can't retreat. He's going to different command centers. He's seeing a lot of actually luxury here, and all the officers who are kind of arguing over where their barber is and all this other stuff, and he's almost in disbelief that they're retreating, and yet all the same, these officers are trying to figure out whether or not their samovar has been dented in the retreat. And this goes all the way up to the general who's trying to get gas from, and when he actually insults the general, and the general for a moment kind of turns to him, and it seems like he's not going to give him the gas, and the guy says, call up the lieutenant overseeing the gas and make him give it to Lieutenant Sarkisian, and I'll have him shot if he doesn't give the man everything he needs. And then he kind of compliments Krymov and says, from one angry man to another, you'll have what you need.
Angry men getting stuff done, I guess.
Yes. And we follow another couple chapters with Sarkisian trying to get this gas. A lot of this part is truly Sarkisian getting gas. While Krymov is waiting, he stays with a peasant village who have just been abandoned by the Red Army, and he stays in the house of some people who are actually really happy that the Red Army are retreating. They have not done super well under the Soviet system, and think back to the prior years. Krymov is later invited by their daughter-in-law, who is now a widow after her husband was killed, to a party of many other peasants in the village, and the daughter-in-law and Krymov end up sleeping in the barn together, and she kind of says, hey, you should stay, and he thinks for a moment and thinks, this would be happy to stay with her, this would be happiness, and then says, this is happiness, but it's not my happiness, and leaves with Lieutenant Sarkisian in the mortar unit. After leaving with Lieutenant Sarkisian, Krymov also visits an old comrade of his once they cross the Don, or the Volga, once they cross the Don again, and at that point reads Stalin's directive of not one step back, which is, of course, when Stalin decrees that any retreat would be treated as a sign of cowardice, and should be anyone who runs should be shot, essentially. Which I should note was also actually the same order that Hitler put on the Wehrmacht at that time in Stalingrad. So not a great time to be on either side, really. We go from here to Lieutenant Kovalyov. We remember that Kovalyov is a friend of Tolya's. We last saw in part 1 yelling at the Shiposhnikovs for their not understanding the front. He's just gotten a letter from Tolya. Tolya is, I think, an equivalent or even higher rank than Kovalyov, and Kovalyov is pretty pissed because Tolya doesn't have any combat experience. And we learn more about his unit and how Kovalyov runs his unit. And we see a familiar face here as Vavilov. Peter Vavilov.
Yes, he's back. I put 3 exclamation points in my book. I was like, yes, get that. Grossman, please don't kill my guy off.
It has been, no joke, almost 400 pages since we last saw Vavilov.
I know. Grossman starts the book with him, and it's just like, all right, wait a minute. We're going to go through 40 other people before we come back to him.
And so we go through the character of many of the people in Kovalyov's brigade, the different types, and there's all sorts that Grossman notes, kind of morally upright ones who are not so morally upright, cowards, funny people, clowns, and they all have a respect for each other. But Vavilov has more than most, because Vavilov is, contrary to expectations, because he's a peasant, is quite educated, in fact, and even on once or twice corrects people who are supposed to know better as their job, the accountants, even the commissar, when he senses that the men aren't understanding what he's trying to say, will turn to Vavilov and ask him, Vavilov, how would you explain this? He's highly respected. He's got noted for having a moral uprightness for his character. Even when one of the Red Army troops, when they're leaving, another man basically tells a local peasant woman, you can have this bunker I was using, you can have it because your home has been destroyed, but you better bring me a bottle of moonshine, otherwise I'm going to destroy it in front of you. And she brings him all she has, which is a shawl, and he throws it down on the ground and kind of laps in her face and gets ready to destroy it. But Vavilov, small man compared to the much larger, younger Red Army soldier, goes over and basically threatens to fight, curses him out for doing this to the peasant woman. And this Red Army soldier kind of acts like he's above it and says, whatever, I didn't really want it anyway. He tries to walk away, and Vavilov pulls him back and says, no, pick up that shawl and give it back to her. And this guy who's he's been chastised but doesn't want to act like it, says, whatever, when I was back in, back east, I had whatever I wanted. I don't even need this shawl, and gives it back to the woman.
You never even wanted the shawl.
So between that and another time when they were on a train and being bombed by Messerschmitts, everyone was running about. And of course, between barrages, it's them getting up and running about, which is causing the most casualties. Whereas, obviously just lying down anywhere is not great odds, but it's better odds than just scampering about. And so Vavilov, in the middle of all that, is just sitting on the side of on the side of the train, smoking, and yelling at everyone else, stop running around, it's going to happen. It's not. And if you move around more, it's more likely to happen. So those two events have made him a real standout among the troops, in addition to being probably the best educated among them, which is where we end part 4 of our series, and also part 1 of the book Stalingrad, confusingly.
He really reminds me of Chapayev, actually, kind of, which was...
Elaborate.
Ended up... No, I don't think I will. I think on my Russian literature podcast, where I'm supposed to be an alleged expert, I think I'll leave it. Just reminds me of Chapayev. No, Chapayev was a book and also a movie, but I think more importantly, a movie that is extremely famous, and it details the life of a fictionalized version of a Red Army commander named Chapayev, and he's very similarly kind of has this peasant upbringing, but he's molded by his political commissar to be a true Soviet general. And there is a scene in the movie where there's a debate between a peasant woman and this group of Red Army soldiers talking about, I can't remember exactly if it was crops stolen or what exactly it was, and it kind of gets resolved in a similar way. And so it is kind of a familiar archetype. But the thing is that I think that Grossman does write a really compelling archetype because of the way that he's able to interweave these sort of other personal details that make it feel like it has really come to life. I don't look at this and think, a boring book of socialist realism. No, I look at this and I read some of the most gut-wrenching scenes I've ever read in my life.
Yeah.
It was a tough part. It was.
This part had some real weight to it. This is, of course, right before the Battle of Stalingrad itself is happening. Which is amazing, first of all. That Grossman was like, I don't know, I'll title the book Stalingrad. Will we get to Stalingrad? Halfway, maybe. We'll see about it. Yeah.
But I kind of like that, I'll say, because I feel like the focus is always on the actual big battle, but not on. There's nothing on the retreat. Nobody talks about the retreat.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it was really interesting to read a couple of perspectives on that.
Especially because it's not... I mean, this part's interesting for, I think, you were talking about this like not just being a piece of socialist realism. In some ways, I actually saw that more strongly in this section than I did in other sections. It came out a little bit more, at least for me, even, like especially in like the order of Stalin to, not one step back, and Krimov reads it and feels like a sense of rightness in it. That scene has a lot of weight in it, and like leading up into it, like the guy who gives it to him feels like it's that he's got the sense of like almost terror or fear at this, but Krimov is like, no, this is just, this is right. And some moments like that, or when later on we're at the peasants and they're like anti-Soviet, and he kind of thinks like, oh, I've executed men for less, but this isn't really going to change anything, so he just chooses to leave and go sleep in the barn instead of staying in their company. It's a little bit stronger, but all the same, like you've said, the features it covers, like the retreat, there's a lot of this is about the military, but it's not a military book, I would say. You're not seeing the glory of battle as some authors like to portray in kind of hyper realistic senses. You're seeing Krimov and his lieutenant for the mortars, just their entire section is just trying to get gas, and the difficulties of finding the officer who will say yes and bullying that officer into saying yes. And once they have the permission, going to the fuel depot and getting denied because they don't fuel during the day because of the danger of German bombers. It's very ordinary. I mean, ordinary for like a war. It's just like just going through the process of trying to do a retreat and how difficult that is. And also the people who get left behind in the retreat, but by very virtue of not being kind of a just, oh, look at this glorious battle. Really, I think, like you were saying, brings in this real sense of interest that I think you might not have in a more straightforward piece of rah Red Army.
I just thought it was comical, actually, a lot of the bureaucratic nature of the retreat, and the fact that you literally do not have a country that has, like, you have literally lost this land. You're setting up in like tents and like camping out in people's houses because you're on the retreat, and you still can't get people fuel. It takes 1,000 different people for this poor guy to go through to just get fuel for his tanks. I mean, probably wouldn't have been comical for him, but there is this kind of dark sense of humor that pervades parts of it, for sure.
Right. It actually, Krimov kind of thinks that as he's looking back on it, because all these officers are treating this so calmly. In fact, one officer is telling a story about like, oh, all these dead crews he's seen, kind of gets Krimov mad about him just treating it as if he's out for like an evening jaunt.
Yeah.
And as Krimov is walking through the camp, he thinks to himself, it occurred to Krimov that these men ought to be taught, in material terms, that no part can survive without the whole. They needed what could be called an object lesson. The first time they retreated, their curtains would be confiscated. The second time, they'd lose their samovar. The third, their pillows. The fourth, their teacups and glasses. They'd have to make do with tin mugs. It should be clear to everyone that with each retreat, it would cost them more than the retreat before. In time, a man would be stripped of his decorations. Then he'd be demoted. And then he'd be shot. So a typical political commissar way to end that, but the underlying joke is, he's coming from a perspective of the frontline soldiers who are sacrificing everything, and they can't even get gas to retreat, which they've been ordered to do because these other officers are too concerned with getting their samovars packed up or getting their shave, which like the general is mad that Krimov interrupts his shave.
Yeah. Well, he talks about how, I can't remember if you read this quote yet or not, about how retreat had become almost a habit for people, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it, especially when it's contrasted to the way that he describes retreating not as this sort of necessity, but actually almost allowing the invasion, right? The way that he says the vast spaces to the east were a dangerous lure. The limitlessness of the Russian steppe was treacherous. It seemed to offer the possibility of escape, but this was an illusion. He describes them being like chained together. So if you retreat, you're not really, you think you're getting into this open space that's safe, but really you're pulling it into your own country. That is, obviously that's how it goes.
Sure, yeah.
But I can kind of, in some senses, I do see there are some elements of socialist realism that do pervade this part. And there's that sort of, I don't know if you want to call it like crass idealism that can sometimes go along with that. The naive sense that, Stalin's words just perfectly encapsulated how I was feeling, and it was just, just burning with righteousness for the way that, Stalin writes this order. But, honestly, I could kind of also get it. If you're just watching your entire country be destroyed as you're retreating, and, for someone to just put their foot down and say, hey, no more retreating, this is it. You gotta respect it.
Yeah. Especially for the time period it's being written in, and also, of course, this is, I think, I want to say that Grossman starts writing Stalingrad in like late 1943. Still like midway through the war when he's flying high on his books. It doesn't have the sort of, I will say, the bitterness or cynicism you see in his later writing, or frankly even in like Life and Fate. Mm-hmm. It's very, like you say, idealistic about its subject.
But I think for me the thing is that it's not always Grossman. I don't look at this and think that this is how Grossman feels. There are so many different characters, like even the peasants that we were talking about, that are supposed to be the example of everything that you're not supposed to be, right? In theory, at least that's what they're supposed to be. They're still relatable, they're still realistic. You don't look at them and you don't think, oh, how disgusting they think this. Like, it's not exact, like, I don't know, it's a little bit hard to, I guess, pinpoint, but to me it just feels very nuanced, all of it. And it's just confirmed that we're gonna have to do Life and Fate very soon after this.
Yeah, really. I mean, to your point about that, the peasants who represent everything wrong, who, again, Krimov, even like they are kind of, the old man, he's pretty drunk when he's doing this, kind of acknowledges that Krimov could shoot him, and Krimov is thinking about it, so they kind of have an understanding of each other.
Yeah.
But Krimov kind of notes that he's sitting across from people who are supposed to be the enemy of everything he stands for, but they're also giving him their homemade moonshine, and like giving him tons of pickles and tomatoes,
and their hospitality is phenomenal. Let's just put it it's great.
So Krimov is simultaneously, dunking on them and saying, well, they really aren't very hard workers, it sounds like. Not like those people out in, other regions of the Soviet Union. Well, not exactly like that. He makes a comment about people who do the least often seem to complain the most about their work, and it compares them to like the hard lands of Belarus, where although there's very little out there, any Red Army soldier who's wounded at their nose, he'll be taken in by 10,000 homes who are happy to help, despite having very little in comparison. So there is that, but again, like even Krimov in the book thinks it's remarkable that I'm sitting across here and they're being very pleasant. They're not a vague enemy of the people who are trying to be wreckers because they just hate human idealism. They've got, their failings are, at least, of course this is just a portrayal of people, but even Grossman trying to write people who are like should be the opposite of what he's trying to portray is like kind of like human failings. It's just people who are like, they're just trying to get by and make their vodka. Really, like they're just trying to live their lives, and they don't care for the kolkhozes, really.
Yeah.
But also this at the same time, when Krimov goes to the peasant party after, when he's invited by the woman, even the peasants there, he kind of makes some jibes at them for being like, are you really celebrating? Are you really, because they're having a massive celebration. I tell them it's because the Germans are going to come, so we don't want to give them anything. And he kind of says, are you celebrating because you don't want them to have anything, or are you celebrating because they're coming? And they kind of like give him sly glances and are almost amused at the question. And it's clear, it doesn't seem like everyone's on the same page, but even while he's in that party, it's like treated almost nicely. Like when the woman who he spends the night with tells him, you should stay. And he says, it's like, it was a happiness. He doesn't say it like, it's not false happiness. He says, it's happiness. This would be a very nice life to just stay here, and we could farm and just live a normal, cool. It sounds like a great life. You just move out to the countryside and you start farming. It's what Tolstoy would want.
Exactly.
But he says it's not his happiness. It acknowledges a difference in the types of happiness you can have, and his sort of Soviet socialist happiness also sort of has this place for that. And so it reminds me of, this is what I was thinking of when I was reading that scene. Actually, this is going to seem very off topic, but have you ever seen The Magnificent Seven?
No.
So it's an old cowboy movie with Yul Brynner. The basic plot line is like a cowboy gets hired by, a poor Mexican town who are like every year they get threatened by bandits, and they can't afford it this year. So they hire a cowboy to defend them, and he's like, I need a team. So he puts together 7 other cowboys.
Are they magnificent?
They are. Well, yeah, it's a magnificent, the Magnificent Seven. Well, except for one of them, but because he's too young to be magnificent, he hasn't made a name for himself yet. And they go on to teach the townspeople how to defend themselves, and they have a great battle and all that. And most of the cowboys die defending the town because, although it's just a job, over the time they kind of learn to love the people. And this Magnificent Seven is essentially a remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, which has basically the same plot line. A Japanese peasant village needs protection from bandits. They hire a samurai. He gets a bunch of other samurai. But the thing I want to focus in on is both movies, basically the 7 defenders share archetypes. And one archetype in both movies is the kind of young man. In the Japanese version, or the original version, the samurai film, this is like kind of a young samurai, and over the course of the film, he falls in love with a young woman of the peasant village. She, at the end of the film, asks him to stay with her. And he basically tells her because of his code that he has to live by as much as he'd like to. He doesn't really say that. It's a very kind of stoic move on his part. He has to go. He has to maintain his code, even though it clearly pains him a great deal. Now, in the Magnificent Seven, the same scene actually happens, except the young man chooses to leave behind being a cowboy and decides to stay with the young woman on her farm, or on her family's farm. And as the 2 surviving cowboys ride off, one of them kind of makes a laconic comment about the guy staying behind, and the other guy looks back and says, well, not really. So you don't look down on him. In fact, he actually chose the right choice because the farmers are the only ones who ever win in these kind of situations, which I've always understood as kind of in the same way that Seven Samurai is kind of a meditation on the constraints of late samurai period. The Magnificent Seven almost feels like a meditation on the cowboy film itself, and far from being a glorious adventure, most of them end up dead. And in fact, the only one who really ends up well is the one who decides to stop being a cowboy and start being a farmer. Only the farmers win. And that's kind of how this scene almost felt to me when I was reading it through, because regardless of how people are coming out on this, regardless of what side they are, and up to this point, Grossman's really been, as a narratorial perspective, has really been harping on, keep in mind, your individual fate is also tied to that of the nation. In the same way he's been talking about that with Vavilov when he doesn't want to leave. And we've been talking about it even in this very section when Krimov is thinking about these officers treating the war as if they have unlimited land to retreat to. These people are living, despite being abandoned by the Red Army, and even the early prose of describing the scene being that these people have been abandoned to darkness. They're sort of not anti-Soviet, just like a-Soviet, it's just a peasant life is treated very kindly and like a happiness that Krimov doesn't even condemn.
And so in that similar way, Stalingrad is kind of a meditation on the cowboy epic.
Yeah, that's why after this, we're going to be covering books by John Dos Passos.
Yes,
for the next year.
Yes. It's going to be a weird year, but we're going to do it. We're going to get through it.
Actually, I don't even know. I don't think John Dos Passos I don't think he was a cowboy writer. I think I'm thinking of a different guy.
How about collect some facts next time before coming to the podcast?
Anyway, but yeah, that's that. I also, speaking of kind of the very, very human element, let's go back to the beginning for a moment, because I really want to talk about 2 things. I want to talk about Zhenya Novikov, and I want to talk about Vera and Zima.
Sure.
I think I have a good time whenever Grossman kind of goes into talking about, I don't know, humans, because he's a very, in your favorite term, non-totalizing about human behavior.
I'd say it. I would say that.
In fact,
he's somebody who understands that the beauty of life is made up of, light and shadow.
Light and shadow, naturally. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think what he has to say about the way that people understand each other, or frankly, fail to understand each other, and sometimes even relationships where they fail to understand each other are just as strong or stronger.
Yeah, this was a really interesting passage. I know where you're going with it, and I just thought, man, nobody went here the way that Grossman went here. Yeah. For real.
Yeah, because it's so relevant, too, because so many of these characters, so much of the conflict, frankly, between Zhenya and Marussia and Sofia Osipovna is born of misunderstanding, or them not really understanding each other in a way, mm-hmm. or frankly understanding each other too well. Zhenya but despite the fact that Zhenya totally gets Vera because Vera is just like her mother, Marussia, they understand each other just well, but in the same way that Zhenya still argues with Marussia, she argues with Vera, mm-hmm. because they frankly understand each other a little too well, and that's why in some senses they fight, because Marussia and Vera both have that same temper, and Genya just can't help but like be mad at it, even though it's she knows that that's like it's kind of unreasonable. Which is why I think it's interesting that like Genya, talking to Novikov, tells the romance of Tristan and Isolde running off from all their responsibilities to go live in the forest, again, a German fairy tale, and tells it as like the great, a great romance, which is now dead in their era. When Vera comes home and tells a similar story of, well, frankly, a similar idea of a German officer falling in love with a Russian woman, and him giving up his life for her, and his only regret being that he couldn't tell her that he didn't regret anything about his decisions. Genya calls it contemptible for their time, despite being not entirely, I would say, kind of the same story in a sense, adapted for the era. It's too similar for perspective. It's fascinating. I don't know. It sounds like you had something to say on it.
I just thought the way that the Grossman portrayed the relationship between Vera and Xena was interesting, because basically the whole scene that he depicts them in is where they kind of have the same reaction to what they're talking about, but they are coming from a completely different angle, or, they're laughing about something and it's a lighthearted conversation, but Vera's thinking like, oh wait, no, wait a minute, I was actually serious about that. It was just interesting. I don't know how to explain it. It's kind of a really good example of something that you can recognize while it's being described, but it's hard to put into words.
Right.
It's a feeling that everybody's felt in a conversation where you're like, is this person actually understanding me while we're talking?
Mm-hmm.
Or what's perhaps even scarier is the fact that maybe you wouldn't even know that it was happening.
Yeah, which they don't.
Like, what if your greatest friendship is born out of a misunderstanding and a continual series of misunderstandings?
Yeah, or maybe even more strongly, an understanding of someone else, of who they think you are, and leaning into that. Like Zima, who it says leans into her image, which Vera has of her in her mind, unrelated to maybe how she feels about herself.
Mm-hmm.
Vera sees her as graceful, so she has, like, when she knows Vera's approaching, I think it's mentioned that she kind of adopts a certain book and reads it in a certain way to give off a certain vibe.
Sure. Yeah, it was just, I don't know, I like this part a lot. It was a good part to discuss.
Yeah, I just Grossman's just great at writing varied character interactions between, I don't know, consistent characters who you feel their motivations and the way it plays out.
Yeah, like, I know this book is only 950 pages, but I just want, like, every character to have their own book.
Yeah, really? Yeah. And also, Grossman's just so good at zingers. I want to...
Please bring us the zinger of the week.
My favorite one from this part, in chapter 69, nice. Kovalyov is thinking of his men. One of them, Ryzhchikov, is kind of a joker and a gifted teller of stories. And it's written about him. People liked him, but they also enjoyed making fun of him. They respected him, but this respect concealed a trace of mockery. He was treated, in short, the way Russians often treat their village and factory poets. They're storytellers and domestic philosophers. If there's like one single sentence I would give to anyone coming into just like Slavic studies, that'd probably be it.
That was a good one.
Anything you read, some amount of seriousness, some amount of mockery. Between those two things, you're going to get the tone of whatever that author's going for.
Yeah, I think I like that, because I think sometimes people take things too seriously. It's an opinion I hold pretty firmly.
Yeah.
Most things are not that serious.
No.
Which does sound weird to say in a long series on perhaps one of the world's most serious topics.
Yeah. But amidst the very serious topic, human life goes on in all its glory, shortcomings, ordinary-heroic moments, ordinary-ordinary moments, as we've been talking about. Among the men the men and women who act heroically, and among the men and women who, in the middle of a retreat, are trying to figure out where to safely keep the drapes so they can reset up a nice looking HQ, a couple miles down the road.
It's got to look good.
Yeah. Okay, I gotta say, I do normally love Grossman's prose. However, it's been the way Grossman writes women in this part is becoming increasingly apparent to me, that every time a woman's introduced, like, it's really her beauty that gets focused on, and most of the time it's just like thrown off, like, okay, she is a beautiful woman. It's like every third woman who's not old is, well, actually, frankly, like every woman who's not old is described as beautiful, which I guess there's a certain amount of equality to that. I also want to say, when he does get into specifics, it's kind of weird. Just like,
which part were you thinking of?
I'm like, when he's thinking of the young woman in the general's office, where he describes her as, what was it? She has the rosy, sorry, this is from memory, the rosy cheeks and the shoulders of a mature woman, but she has the hands and the lips of the hands and lips and eyes of a young girl. It was, maybe again, I've been blind to this because I was reading, like, actually recently, like a month and a half back, reading Murakami's 1Q84, and if you've never read 1Q84, then you aren't going to be familiar with just the absolute relentlessness with which Murakami talks about women's bodies. Like, you cannot talk about a single woman without talking about her chest. Even if you've like met that woman many times before. I think a woman gets murdered at some point, and all her friend can think about is like her naked friend's breasts in the moment of murder. It's real weird. It's like 1,000 pages long, and like half the characters are women, so it's nonstop. It's like it's a real gauntlet. So maybe I've been like snowblind after that experience to things were just being like, she had adult shoulders but childlike hands.
Yeah.
But it kind of stuck out when he would like describe women as like high-breasted or similar things. Very, very descriptions that stuck out to me.
Yeah. I don't have much to say on that other than yeah. Like, yeah.
I don't think there's too much to...
I thought you were going to talk about Victor and Nina, potentially.
Oh, we can talk about that too. I think I've been thinking about it a lot because I think when I was reading... I've been reading Grossman's other short stories, and that was also what I was noticing, because I think it was in the Hell of Treblinka when he kept talking about like women in Treblinka as beautiful. I was like, I don't know if this is like really the time.
Yeah.
Obviously, you do you. Yeah, you're the writer. You're the one who was in Treblinka. But I think after that, it started standing out to me more reading this part too. But yeah, let's talk about Victor and Nina for a second.
It's not a specific thing I was going to say about it, but rather a more general maybe comparison from an authorial perspective, which is sometimes the uncomfortable comments are not made from the author, but from the perspective of the character. And when you have a book like one that's written from Tolstoy or one that's written from Grossman, the way that it's separated is not always clear. And the way that they switch between their perspective and the character's perspective can sometimes make it seem like the author feels this way, when in fact he is writing it from the character's perspective. So that's what I was just going to say on that. Right. I don't have a specific example of that, but I was wondering if that's where you were going with that train of thought. But it is something that the more you read, the more you're like, okay. And I'm sure there is a more scholarly explanation that you could give, but for all intents and purposes, it is a little weird.
I don't know if you need a superly scholarly explanation for a history of men writing books where they're like really get into talking about women's bodies. That one's just kind of
I'm sure someone's tried.
Yeah. There's this series of noir novels I love. I honestly wish I could remember the guy who writes it is kind of great, Peter Vox or something, like Vachs. And if you look at his I got the books because of his author profile, which is like he's got a man who's got like an eye patch over one eye. He looks totally wild, and it's like, yeah, this man's been a lawyer, an activist, the director of like a juvenile prison for whatever. And like, this is so weird. It's all from the 90s. You expect this noir series to be like really grimy and gross, which it is, but it's like he's writing a grimy and gross world, but it doesn't feel like one that the author is condoning. It feels like one that these are the ones the characters exist in and try to fight back on. Like, considering that was written in like the late 80s, early 90s, the fact that there's like one of the characters is a trans woman, and the guy, like the main character, absolutely goes to bat for her and is like willing to like fight anyone who is, who goes after her, and she like talks through her struggles and like has a very human arc through this, and like it's it's a cast of people who come from very different backgrounds, all treated very respectfully. Not at all what I'm expecting for this series. I'm like, on the whole, the noir series is like, yeah, relatively good for its time period, but also like you can really tell the author's fetishes, because in every single book there's like one woman involved with the mystery, and she always has the exact same body type, and the guy gets really into talking about like those features, and the main character always sleeps with her, and you're like, okay, this is like, on the whole, this is a pretty good series. Like a little weird how obviously I can see that you were
yeah,
like a little like turned on when you were writing these scenes. It's really apparent. So like,
okay, can I try it? It? Okay,
go for it.
I am gonna bat for Grossman. I'm not saying that this is my 100% opinion, because I would need a lot more rereading, but I think that, and this maybe doesn't work for all the scenes, but just trying to work through this, if you were on the front lines of a very brutal war, I think that just conceptually the idea of beauty might be very striking to you, just in a broad aesthetic sense. When you are literally seeing people just die around you, you're just like face down in the trenches, like day after day. And so like these specific parts, I'm wondering if they don't correlate with some broader sense of beauty, of childlike nature that Grossman wants to have preserved in people. So adult shoulders could be corresponding to hard work, heavy labor, all the things that you would be doing on a front line, I would imagine. I have not fought in a war, would not like to. Having these sort of kind of childlike eyes, perhaps it's linked to, she still retains this sort of childlike perception of the world, which is in some sense beautiful, that anybody who has seen what war has looked like would be able to maintain that. Now, that would be a scholarly spin. Is that what Grossman was thinking, or did he just think she was pretty? I don't know. I really don't. But I do think that for Grossman specifically, it is a little bit of a different case than some other writers.
Yeah. I mean, it's... Yeah, I don't even imply this is like feels super egregious in the way I've read other books. It's just kind of funny how like every single woman who's like not an old woman is beautiful.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of, there's this, oh god, this series I read when I was really young. I don't, what is it called? The Dresden Files, where like every single woman is like the most beautiful woman this character has ever seen, even if it's like some kid that like he saw grow up and is like, yeah, now that she's like 18, she's the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. And she's like, I'm seeing a weird trend here, dude.
Yeah.
Also, that particular case, real weird. Anyway,
I don't think Grossman's that bad, but I will.
I don't know. I would never go that. I would not say that. That's definitely not Grossman. It's just kind of funny. There are cases where I'm like Murakami, or I'm like, dude, I had to put the book down because like there was just so much versus Grossman, where it's just like kind of funny.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that it's probably the case, kind of like you're describing, but I don't have it worked out yet. But there are definitely constantly on his mind are questions of love, and this is across a lot of socialist realism that I've read, really pervasive questions for the authors that you would not think that would be the case for, and it's just constantly there, beating in the back of the characters' heads.
That's a good point. If we especially want to apply it to Krimov, the way that Krimov as sort of the local upright communist of the book, versus when we're reading very early, going back to Envy, for example, which I think is kind of characteristic Envy or Cement, or even to some degree Vasilisa Maligina, the idea of family and parenthood is really put under the idea of creating the next generation. That's the important thing. And we need to raise these children collectively, and the family unit needs to be broken down. And we need to find a new way that's not so outdated and capitalist and so on and such forth. Whereas Krimov, the upstanding communist of this book, at least so far, really wants a family. He explicitly said that he kind of wants a family commune. He wants his brother to come so he can take his nieces and nephews out to the zoo when he comes home from work, and putting them on his shoulders and run them around. He's like very family oriented. When the woman invites him to stay, he's really tempted, even though he knows it's not his happiness. He acknowledges it as a happiness. So yeah, it's definitely the question of love. even from it is, I don't know. I don't want to call it like kind of love in a more traditional sense than you see in like early Soviet literature, but kind of is. And like thinking about like in the other books, people are trying to create a new form in early Soviet work or late Russian Empire, trying to create new forms of love or family, whereas this one is, I don't know, it's relatively conservative in comparison.
Yeah, it is actually, which is kind of tracked with the times as it developed. That's not, I guess, a jarring. I mean, well, it is jarring as you're reading it, but knowing a thing or two about Soviet history as I do, it is kind of right. You get it, right? You get it. Yeah. No, it's not surprising, but just we've been reading these texts one after another. Really, is hammering the point home. Yeah, the differences in time periods. Yeah. Is there any other oh yes, go on. No, this is my wrap up thought. Is just I'm excited to have this as one of the core foundational pieces that we can refer back to and be like, remember in Stalingrad, this part, it's going to be great.
I'm looking forward to it, especially as we get into presumably life and fate, and maybe on a sooner timeline than we'd guessed to ourselves.
Yeah, and then everything flows. It's going to be great.
Just welcome back to the Vasily Grossman podcast.
I stand by it. It's like our best series for me. I feel like
it's been a lot of fun. It's been, I don't know why, but this feels like kind of a moment of like, I don't know why. Reading this book has felt it makes me think about our other work a lot more, or thinking of versus early Soviet stuff versus Tolstoy, arguments happening in other, in Gorky's work and so on and such forth. It makes me think about a lot of what we've been reading previously in a way that not every work we've read previously has kind of made me think self-referentially.
Yeah, it's fun. It's definitely a tough read.
Yeah.
For many reasons.
Yes. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's not one I could say you can jump right into. It's
not a fun weekend read, to say the least.
No. It also requires, I would say, like kind of a high level of, not high level of knowledge, but like a non-zero level of knowledge of World War II on the Eastern Front, which Grossman, although is trying to, set the scene for you, is writing for the Soviet public in right. this, well, not necessarily in the 60s, but like people who presumably have a cultural memory of the war rather than the people who maybe have a cultural memory of the Western Front or of the Pacific War, and so on and such forth.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that can be left unsaid, I think. Mm-hmm. So, anyways.
Yeah.
It's a good book. I want to hear what other people have to say about it. Drop us a line. tipsytolstoy@gmail.com. We'll read it on the podcast, and we'll talk about it.
Yeah. This has been good. I've had a lot of fun doing this. Matt, I know it's in our script. Part 5, Stalingrad. We're going to be reading that next time, or part 5 of part 2. It's very confusing, and I'm confusing it more by saying it more often, but that's kind of my goal here.
I've lost track of what we're reading next, yeah.
Good. So we're continuing on. Presumably, I don't know if we have like exact page number, but I imagine we're going to be reading till about in the New York Review of Books edition. We're probably going to be reading to about page 500, give or take, like a chapter.
We're going to read through chapter 19. As you were bumbling on that, I was quickly, furiously looking at where we were going to end.
Very beautiful. Yeah. So in part 2, chapters 1 through 19.
Boom.
Before we go on to our, wonderful outro that I'm sure everyone listens to and we don't know that everyone turns off because of statistics.
Absolutely.
On a scale of 1 to Yeltsin, how drunk are you?
7.
Nice.
I was up there. I'm coming down because we didn't take a break in this episode, and it was a really long episode. Like, remember when we would do a 35-minute episode and we're like, boom, podcast. Now it's like we're going to hit an hour and a half, presumably somewhere in the series. And I'm not saying that's going to be our standard forever, but for this series, it definitely is.
We honestly might in this one because we still need to add the context, and we're about an hour and 16 in prior to editing. So
yeah, that's a little bit of movie magic for everyone listening in at home.
So for all of you who just listened to that part, we're actually on 1 minute or 1 hour and 12 minutes. That's how much content was taken out. Ooh,
scary.
Cameron,
you can't leave me hanging. Where did you end up?
Sure. I am, so unfortunately I did too much talking, so I only got through 1.5 of these tall boys. So I'm only like a 4, I would say.
Okay.
They're stouts, but they're only like 6%, so they're not really like the alcohol content I expect of a stout, but still good. I've enjoyed them so far.
Yeah. And it's the flavor that counts.
Exactly. Great flavor. Highly recommended if you live in an area where they sell Central California Valley beers. And before we let you go, we wanted to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current patrons: Haley, Blake, Sharon, Maya, Pack Rob, Zachary, Austin, Isaac, Brett, Caitlin, Shirley, Eli, Julie, Stephanie, Alex, Yitza, Joanne, Mysterious Donor Dude, Elise, Cole, Allison, Brandon, Arini, Lou, Jesse, Paige, Jack, Daniel, Darren, Daniel, Janice, Anne, Madeline, and Jeff. Oh, okay, all in one breath. I'm catching up to how Matt can do it now. Podcasting isn't free and grad school doesn't pay very well, so if you're interested in joining out with our current patrons to keep the show running, take a look at our Patreon at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy. The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you're looking for other places to find us, you can also follow us on Instagram at Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast or on Twitter at Tipsy Tolstoy, or you can join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.